discussion on the surface has been about philosophy of religion, but there's kind of a sub-theme that's a very important one. It concerns logic and reasoning. And these are sort of examples of that area of philosophy, logic. Logic pervades the whole field, in the sense that we're trying to assess arguments, and the way to assess them is twofold. I mean, one can assess the logic of the arguments or assess the assumptions of the argument, but that's pretty much it. I'll get back to that in a second. But in pursuit of this discussion of logic, I want to prove to you that 2 equals 1, discuss the nature of proof a little bit, and that'll be a convenient way for us to move over into the other styles of arguments that are not quite proofs that have been offered, at least a couple of other examples. So bear with me for a moment. This doesn't seem to have anything to do with philosophy of religion on the surface, but there is a connection. And I think it might amuse you. All right, the way this works, how many have seen this before? A proof that 1 equals 2. Okay, I'm going to ask you to remain quiet when we critique it later on, since you know, I presume, what's wrong with it. And so I guess you probably anticipated that something would be wrong with it if I was going to prove that 1 equals 2. But it begins this way. Okay, we're going to let A equals B. So we're going to start out with special cases when these 2 variables are equal to one another. It doesn't matter what their value is. It could be 2 billion. It could be 6. It could be 5. It could be any number at all, just as long as A and B are equal to one another. So there's lots of cases where that's going to come up. First thing we do is we're going to multiply both sides by A. You can multiply equals by equals, so A squared equals AB. Next step, we're going to subtract equals from equals. We're going to subtract the same thing from both sides. So we're going to get A squared minus B squared equals AB minus B squared. Then we're going to factor. And some of you will remember the way to factor the difference of 2 squares is like this. A squared minus B squared is the same as A minus B times A plus B. And on this side, what we're going to do is to factor it is just pull that B out. So that's B times A minus B. Those 2 things are equal. So all we're doing in that step is to factor both sides. In the next step, we're going to divide both sides. We've got a common factor on those 2 sides. We're going to divide both sides by the same thing. And so that leaves us with A plus B equals B. Okay? Now we're going to use the fact, we haven't used it yet, we're going to use the fact that we began with, namely that A equals B. And we're going to substitute B for A where it occurs here. B plus B equals B. Then we're going to just bring these 2 together. That's the same as 2B equals B. And finally, we're going to divide both sides by the same factor, and we get 2 equals 1. QED. So there's the proof that 2 equals 1. Now, the reason for bringing this up is that we've been talking about proofs. We talked about a proof last week, a proof of God's existence that's quite old and has convinced many, many people. One has to be wary of proofs, of course. As I mentioned a second ago, the 2 things you have to watch out for in any supposed proof, or even in any supposed argument, are these. First, are the assumptions from which the thing starts, are they reasonable? And we went through the assumptions in Anselm's argument in great detail. I was making considerable effort in trying to make those plausible to you. Then the second thing you may ask about any proof or argument when you analyze it is, are the steps that when we move from one thing to another using logic, is the reasoning acceptable? Does the thing drawn out as a conclusion, does it really follow, according to the rules of logic, from the thing it's drawn out from? Here we're using the special rules of math. And again, asking that those who know the answer to this question, who've seen this proof before, let's put it that way, or let me even expand that. Anyone who is absolutely sure they see precisely what the problem is. No doubt at all in their minds. They know what the problem is with this proof. I'd like you to remain quiet for a second because I'd like others to have a chance to puzzle through this thing. And for the rest of you who aren't absolutely positive you know what the problem is, what do you think it might be? Can you all see that pretty well? Yeah.
Like, if you replace like the letters with numbers, then like the third line will give you 0.
Okay, say that louder, please.
If you replace the letters with numbers, then the third line will give you 0.
Certainly it would. So in the cases where A equals B, the third line, let's number these things just so we know what we're talking about. This is 1, 2. Third line isn't hard to keep track of, but as we go down further, it might be convenient to have these numbers. So the third line is equal to 0. So what?
If it's equal to 0, then
Both sides are equal to 0, though, aren't they?
yeah, but if you have 0, then yeah.
0 equals 0. That's what it says. Is that false?
At the bottom it says 2 equals 1.
Well, that's right. It's a surprise, but where's the problem? I mean, we've got 0 equals 0, 2 equals 1. Now, those things don't contradict one another, do they? I mean, 0 equals 0 is quite a different thing from 2 equals 1. And indeed, this is such a peculiar thing to prove. This is pretty, like if that were true, then who knows what else is true. But there's nothing wrong with saying that 0 equals 0, is there?
Well, you really, if it's just 0 equals 0, you can't factor it or reduce it or anything like that without taking up 0.
Well, not if you, that's right. If you express it in that way, then you couldn't do any factoring. But is there any problem with the move from 3 to 4? Is there any problem in the math anywhere in this thing? And yet we seem to have proven that 2 equals 1. Brian?
Number 6 doesn't look right because if you put 1 in, it would have to be 1 plus 1.
Well, that's just the beginning of the peculiarity we conclude with. I mean, we see it's just staring at there's a weirdness that stares at us in line 8, and that comes directly from 6. Is there anything odd in the move from 5 to 6 or 6 to 7 or 7 to 8? Still sticking with the people who aren't absolutely positive. Let's move to the people who are absolutely positive. What's wrong with this?
You move from 4 to 5. If A equals B, you're dividing by 0.
Aha! Now you're also going to get, you're going to learn an interesting mathematical fact. Now you've always heard that you can't divide by 0 in math, right? I hope that you've always heard that. You should always heard that. In other words, in math, and this is really quite important. Move that for a second. This is false. I put that line in there to say that this is not true. 1 over 0 doesn't equal anything. It doesn't equal infinity. It's just not defined. And the reason it's not defined is something you've just now seen. If you were allowed to divide by 0, you could prove anything in the world. You could prove, for example, that 1 equals 2. It inserts into mathematics a terrible problem. It would render mathematics inconsistent. So this 1 over 0 is simply not defined, and you now know why it's not defined. Let's go back and see what happens. I just want to make sure that everybody sees what that is. In any case where A equals B, then A minus B is equal to 0. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with anything's being 0, and there certainly isn't anything wrong with zeros being 0, so there's no problem up through step 3. And indeed, there's no problem in the move from 3 to 4, because this is the correct factoring of 3. But, as you point out, when you move from 4 to 5, you're dividing both sides by equals, which is okay in any case except if the thing is 0. You can't divide by 0. And that's where, and everything else is fine too once we get to 5, but it's that move from 4 to 5 that's the problem. Now, the reason for offering you this as a quick example of a fallacious proof, a mistaken proof. And also offering you a quick analysis that shows that there is a problem and pinpoints the problem. This is the same sort of analytic problem that Anselm's proof presents. I mean, it's an interesting intellectual object just because it seems like it proves something that you shouldn't be able to prove that way. So then the question is, where's the problem? That's the perennial question over the years. Is the problem in one of those assumptions? Maybe we shouldn't have gone along with it. Or is the problem, as it is in this thing, is the problem involved somehow with the logic? Now there's a third possibility that I want to raise with respect to Anselm's argument. Maybe, I mean, I think this is a possibility, and this is a real live possibility. I don't know where the problem is. I'm not being coy with you. It may be that there's something wrong with the proof, even though the assumptions are all okay, and the definition as far as it goes is okay, and the logic is okay. What it may be is that what we've proven is something that we don't normally take as being equivalent to God. I mean, after all, given the definition that God is that than which nothing greater can even be conceived, if that's the definition, then maybe we really have proven the real existence of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. I'm not sure. But since we're on this, consider this concept. I'm not sure whether this works or not. I'm just offering you this as something off the top of my head that might qualify. Everything might qualify as something than which nothing greater can even be conceived. Now, in one way, of course, you can just imagine there's one more thing, but then the thing that you just were calling everything isn't everything, right? How about everything possible? Maybe that will do it. Could there be something greater than that? Or how, we're going to stick with the definition of greater. See what we've done. We've just taken a bunch of words, that than which nothing greater can even be conceived, and we've proven its existence. Now, it might be that we were right in saying that that's a necessary condition if something's going to be God. Right? It may be that anything that was God would have to qualify that, would have to satisfy that condition. But maybe other things do too, other things that aren't God, like just everything or everything possible. I'm not sure whether that works, but it might be that there's something that's not God, some concept that isn't the concept of God, that also could be thought of as that than which nothing greater can even be conceived. If so, then we haven't necessarily proven the existence of God. Now, what I'm saying here in brief is that maybe the definition that we agreed to is a decent, necessary condition of God's existence, but not a sufficient condition. Maybe it's just not enough. Maybe in order for something to be God, it would have to satisfy not only that necessary condition, but something else too. In which case, all we've proven is that something short of being God must exist. Got to confess to you, though, even that seems weird to me, that we could prove the existence of anything out of just definitions and concepts seems bizarre. And that's what's kept people at this proof for all these years. And people keep still going back to it and trying to figure out what's right about it, what's wrong about it. And the attraction of Anselm's proof, is just like the attraction of this thing. It just seems so weird. There must be something wrong with it. And so then you keep hacking away at it until you figure out what is the problem. So that's the general philosophical interest in this. The Anselm's proof is interesting not so much as an interesting theological argument, an argument about God, strangely. It's more interesting when you're trying to figure out, the logic of the thing, as a logical exercise. All right, now what I want to go on to today is some more realistic arguments for God's existence. And what I mean by realistic arguments is this. I think these will seem familiar to you. They'll seem like the arguments that real people use, that real people have for believing in God. And so they will have, as one of their advantages, that they're not so far out, abstract, and philosophical. But one more note just about arguments in general before I go on. We have over here on this side Anselm's ontological argument. Ontological. And then over on this side, we have the two that we're going to discuss next. Both of them share an important characteristic. There's the cosmological argument. And the teleological. That word is not theological, it's teleological. It's very different. And I want to at first stress what it is that these two have in common that makes them different from Anselm's. There's probably a number of things, but the most important is, uses a Latin word, this argument is an a priori argument. These two arguments are a posteriori arguments. What's that mean? Well, you remember that this is supposed to be a proof. These are not proofs in the strong sense, in the strong technical sense of proofs. These are arguments. The word a priori sometimes is used to modify arguments. So you talk about a priori arguments. You can also talk about a priori knowledge. That would be all these things would share the same characteristic. You can talk about a posteriori knowledge, a posteriori arguments. What they all have in common is the a priori stuff doesn't depend upon experience. Whereas a posteriori stuff does. For example, I mean, if I were to say 2 plus 3 equals 5, that can be done by analyzing the meanings of those terms. I mean, there's 2 and there's 3. I mean, I don't have to have lots of experiences with putting 3 things and 2 other things together to learn that 2 plus 3 equals 5. I just need to know the definition of 5 and 2 and 3 and plus. 5 just is 2 and 3. I mean, that's just what 5 is. If I wanted to find out whether bachelors were unmarried or not, I wouldn't need to take a survey or a poll. I mean, you can imagine this perhaps as a possible national science foundation project that somebody might apply for. They might go ask for funding for a project where they were going to take a series. They were going to try and get a little survey to all the bachelors in the world. The survey would have only one question on it. It would be, are you married? And they want funding, you see, and you're the agency, and they write to you and they say, please give me a grant for $100,000. I know that there's a lot of bachelors out there. It's going to take a lot of time. I got to get these polls to all of them, or as many as possible, because I want to find out whether bachelors are unmarried. You'd say, in your wisdom, that's ridiculous. You don't need to take a survey. Look the word up in the dictionary, right? And from an understanding of the meaning of the terms, that's all you need to know. I mean, you don't need to go take a survey. You don't need to go out and get some sort of experience, an experimental result here. But if I want to know what the orbit of Neptune is, I need to go out and observe. I need to have experiences. I need to make tests for other things. All of those things depend on experience. So all the arguments in the natural sciences, as well as almost all the things that normal people regularly believe, they do depend on experience, and so all that knowledge is a posteriori. But anything that you can deduce from meanings alone, all that stuff is a priori knowledge. Okay? We'll just use those terms in that way for this discussion. And the thing I want to make clear is that Anselm's argument was an a priori one, whereas these two new ones that we're going to talk about, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, they're both a posteriori. Now, before we leave that, let me mention the advantages and disadvantages of each, which I think should be clear by now. If you have an a priori argument, you've got a knockdown proof. You've got something that's indisputable. You can prove that stuff. Disadvantages is that there's not a real wide field of application. Pure math and pure logic are the only uncontroversial areas of application for a priori arguments. And pure definitions, arguments in any area that are purely definitional. So, advantage. It's proof. So I'll say certainty. Disadvantage. Limited application. That's why it seems astonishing that we should be able to prove God's existence or the existence of anything else in reality just from an a priori argument. I mean, how could you go from definitions or pure concepts out to reality? I think that's probably most of your intuitions about that proof when you first looked at it. You shouldn't be able to do that. That doesn't make any sense. Over here, though, the advantage of a posteriori arguments is their wide applicability. Disadvantage I'll put it this way, non-certainty. There's always a chance that the argument's not right, because after all, it's based only on what limited experiences you've been able to have. And even all the experience of the human species is still limited in principle, given all the future experiences that there are to have. So that, for example, our laws of physics, which we're really quite comfortable with, they sure seem to look good. We have experience with this from past drafts of the laws of physics. It's real likely that in 100 or 200 years they'll have to be amended in the light of further experience, further experiment, further observation. We learn new things. So that no matter how secure you are, and I use the laws of physics as an example of some of the stuff that we're most secure about, no matter how secure you are about any conclusions that you draw on the basis of a posteriori arguments, you can never be absolutely certain. There's always that element of possible doubt. And all you can say is, well, as far as we know so far, this is the way things look. Any questions about that? Okay, these concepts of a priority and a posteriority. These are going to become, these will be important later, so I want you to remember those things. And now let me move to the cosmological argument. Okay. It's also called the argument from cause. Or causation. That, in fact, is where the experience part comes into this particular argument. It might begin something like this. This will be different, perhaps, from the way it was presented in the reading. But just to cut right to the chase, it says, we all know that everything that happens in the world happens for some reason. Now, do we all know that? Well, I think that the person who was advancing this argument might even refer to science. Might say, look, we sometimes maybe have thought in our past that certain things just happen for no reason at all. But every time we've investigated these things, whether it's in our own particular lives or whether it's in the life of the whole species, the history of the whole species, every time we've done a thorough investigation of anything that seemed like it happened for no reason at all, we've always found out that there was some reason behind it. So what it's based on is something called the principle of sufficient reason. Okay. Which I'm going to talk about as if it had two different versions. The most general version is just what I said. Nothing happens for no reason at all. And again, do you remember when we talked about Aristotle's four causes? We were talking about four different ways of explaining things. We're not limiting ourselves. We're saying, in this general version, we're not limiting ourselves to what Aristotle called efficient causes. All this means is, that in the general version, is that nothing happens that without an explanation. I mean, there's an explanation for everything. I guess that's the way to put it briefly. This simply says there's an explanation for everything. Nothing happens for no reason at all. It doesn't necessarily refer to what we would call causes and effects. It doesn't necessarily refer to efficient cause. So the reason for it, all this says is that everything has some explanation. It might be a formal explanation of the kind we talked about before. It might be a teleological explanation. It might be a material explanation. Or it might be an efficient explanation, efficient cause explanation in Aristotelian terms. But all this one says is there's going to be some explanation for everything. It doesn't commit itself to saying there's going to be all four. And who knows, I think back then when we were talking about Aristotle, I mentioned, who knows, there might be others. I'm not trying to argue, although Aristotle did, that there were only four modes of explanation. There might be others that I can't think of, that he didn't think of. But this doesn't commit to anything other than the simple thesis that there's going to be some explanation for everything. Now that's the general version, and that's going to be what drives the second draft of the cosmological argument that we'll get to after the first draft. The first draft, the most straightforward and probably the earliest kind of cosmological argument for God's existence, involved a particular interpretation of the principle of sufficient reason, which I'll call, using this word now in the modern meaning of cause, I'll call the causal interpretation. And that says everything that happens has a cause. Okay? You see the difference. This doesn't commit itself to any one particular kind of explanation. This one boldly says everything that happens has a cause. And it's that principle established one way or another. But it doesn't follow from logic alone that everything happens has a cause. That's supposed to be something that we can learn through our own personal experience, and it's something that we can read off of the experience of the entire species. That we've learned this. It's on this causal interpretation that we go to the first draft of the cosmological argument. All right, now, that requires us to imagine a timeline, because causes and effects are things that happen in time. Cause and effects involve events. One event causes another event. One event is the effect of earlier events. It always works that way, it seems, on most people's interpretations, although there's philosophical controversy about this too, like there is about just about everything else in the world, but usually it's held that causes must precede their effects. I mean, one reason to doubt that is, let's say I sit in a chair and I make a dent in the chair. The thing that's actually doing the causing and the cause and effect seem to happen sort of simultaneously. I mean, the dent that's being caused in the chair is happening as I sit. It's not like I sit first, or it's not like I put pressure on the cushion first and then the dent emerges. The dent seems to kind of evolve with the sitting. So, I mean, there's a situation where you can easily say, well, I decided to go sit in the chair and then I sat in the chair. I mean, that arranges itself very nicely in time. But the actual things that you want to bring together as cause and effect, as you get closer and closer to what's really going on, it seems like they're happening simultaneously, not one after the other. But forget that for now. That's a peculiar problem. This is a timeline. The future is over there, and the past is this way. I'm going to put an arrow there. And this first draft of the cosmological argument goes like this. It says, well, here, let's say, imagine that we're here. This is us. And this is the entire universe. This is just a timeline. And so this is supposed to, if this makes sense to say, and that's a problem in contemporary physical terms, but if it makes sense to say that there is a situation of the entire universe at this particular time, that's what this line is supposed to represent. And on the basis of this idea that everything that happens has a cause, the causal interpretation of the principle of sufficient reason, those who like the cosmological argument, who propose it, say, look, everything that's going on in the universe right now has a cause. Everything. Every single thing that's happening. And of course, all of those causes, those causal events, happen earlier. It's never the case that the cause of something is in the future, at least. So goes the argument anyway. So let's call, this is us, let's say that each and every one of the events that's happening now can be referred back to an earlier event, or if you like, an earlier state of the universe, which is its cause. Okay? And then all of those events are the effects of yet earlier causes. And all of those events are the effects of earlier causes, etc., etc., etc. Clear so far? I mean, everything that happens has a cause, and that's true at every preceding moment, ... Now, the problem here is this, and this is a problem for the first draft anyway. We can either think about this past-going sequence of causes, we can think about that in one of two ways. There's only two logical possibilities. Either it keeps going back infinitely with no beginning, right? Or it has a beginning. That's like saying that there's a stopping point. To say that it has a beginning is that it runs up against what? A first cause. So either there's a first cause, which itself wasn't caused, or this series goes back infinitely without any cause at all, with no first cause. Now, those are the two logical possibilities. Let's examine the possibility that there was no first cause. Well, okay, no first cause. That means that nothing happened first, then nothing would have come from that, and nothing would have come from that, and in fact, the things that are happening now wouldn't be happening because there's no first cause. I mean, if there was no first cause, then nothing ever would have happened. The whole thing wouldn't have ever gotten started. But plainly it did. It's obvious that it did get started. Here we are in the middle of a bunch of events. So that first possibility, the first logical possibility, is impossible. It can't be that there was no first cause. There has to have been a first cause. And for our purposes, that first cause has to have been powerful enough, since it was the first cause and it was itself uncaused, that we might as well call it God. Now, this argument is usually put together with several other different arguments which establish all kinds of different features of God. But in this case, this is supposed to establish the necessity of something like a creator God or a creator being, something that is responsible. It's itself uncaused, you see, and yet this thing is responsible for the entire later sequence of the universe. If you think that it's the Big Bang, you say, well, it doesn't have to be God, right? Well, just ask yourself the question that some physicists even ask, namely, what caused the Big Bang? I mean, why the Big Bang? As long as you can keep going back and back and back, you haven't gotten to this ultimate point. But this argument, the first draft of the cosmological argument, suggests that you can't do that infinitely, because then the whole series would never have gotten started, and plainly it did. So there has to have been a first cause, and let that be God. And that's it. That's the argument. Now, it's not supposed to be a proof. It's just supposed to be a plausible argument. And yet, well, let me ask you what your reactions to it are. It has a fatal flaw, and to credit the very people who thought up this proof, it's they who, after a while, detected the flaw themselves, and that sent them to the second draft of the cosmological argument. But I wonder if you can see what the flaw is. Anybody? Well, what's the thing start out with? The whole argument is based on what as its founding premise?
Something that was uncaused.
Say it again?
Something that was uncaused.
That doesn't start with something that was uncaused. What does it start with? What does it start with?
Something must cause something else.
It starts with the causal interpretation of the principle of sufficient reason. So it's the fundamental assumption that it begins with, based admittedly on experience, but still seemingly solid, is everything that happens has a cause. That's what it starts with. What's its conclusion? There's something that's happened, or existed anyway, that didn't have a cause. Now that's a problem, right? Here we've got an argument. It starts off, everything has a cause, blah, 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 blah. Last line, something doesn't have a cause. What's the problem? This contradicts the assumption. I mean, you've just proven something that contradicts your assumptions. That means this assumption is not correct. So you can't base any argument on that. Now, it might very well be that there's a first cause. It might very well be there's a God. This little line of reasoning that I'm presenting to you now doesn't have anything to do with religion in particular. It's just, this It's just that this argument, the first draft of the cosmological argument, undermines itself. It negates. This is the negation of this. It negates the assumption on which it's based. So that assumption isn't a good assumption, and so you can't base an argument on it, right? So there's the problem with that. The argument contradicts itself. So let me tell you what they did. I can do it down here. To sort of go back to the drawing board and reconstruct this thing, they said, well, maybe that means that we have to take more seriously this possibility that we thought we'd ruled out. I mean, we thought we'd ruled out the possibility that this series goes back infinitely. But maybe if we take seriously the idea that everything that happens has a cause, maybe what we have to do is to, even though it's hard to conceptualize, maybe we have to just concede that that means that there's no beginning in time. There's no beginning. There's always just this infinite series. It goes infinitely into the past. Perhaps it goes infinitely into the future. Events causing events, never having a beginning, even though, it's still hard to conceive. How could that be if it never has a beginning? But let's let that slide. Maybe it's just a problem with our conceptual capacities. Let's just imagine that this series goes back infinitely. And there we are again. So we're not going to get anywhere trying to pinpoint something as being the first cause. There isn't a first cause. Nevertheless, we still have the more general version of the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing happens or exists. I should have said it that way, because existence is supposed to be in there too. Nothing happens or exists for no reason at all. Now that's not necessarily, that doesn't have to do with causes anymore. And this line represents the history of the universe. It represents the universe in not just in a snapshot, but throughout its infinite, ongoing life, right? Well, the question is, how come it's here? Not what started it. Why is there this infinite sequence? We're conceding that it's an infinite sequence, but we still have the question, why is there this infinite sequence? Nothing happens or exists for no reason at all. There must be an explanation. Now, just think about this. Here is, if you think about this as a path. Now, I don't want you to think about time as going around in a circle. That's an entirely different thesis. That's not what I'm referring to. But I want you to see that I've put up here a path that has no beginning and no end. You could make this very, very large. It has no beginning and it has no end. The question arises, though, how did it get there, right? Now, you know the answer about this path. I drew the sucker, right? I drew that path right here on this piece of paper, and you watched me do it. Now, I did have to have a beginning and an end to my path in the drawing of it, but I might have had a stamp, right? I don't have to have done it that particular way. I might have had a stamp, and I could have just stamped it on the page. Now, it still would have no beginning and no end. But there still would be an account for how it got there. Go back to the universe in its timeline. We are conceding that this timeline has no beginning and no end, no first cause. But we want to know what accounts for its existence. Why isn't there nothing at all? Why is there this instead of nothing? Well, I think you understand the question. The answer given in the second draft of the cosmological argument is, God is what explains that. Because after all, once again, based on the principle of sufficient reason, there must be an explanation. Nothing happens for no reason at all. We're not looking anymore for a causal explanation so much as we just want to understand why this universe is here. God is what explains it. There has to be something that explains it. It will be something quite awe-inspiring and remarkable. Awe-inspiring and remarkable enough to allow us to call it God. And that's the end of that argument. And it does not fall into the same trap. Not the same trap. I don't see right off the top of my head any traps it does fall into. It doesn't fall into the same trap anyway as the causal version, the first draft of the cosmological argument. Any questions or comments? Meg.
So the answer to why is this the infinite sequence would be the explanation of some being like God.
Yeah.
There.
Some, see here, this is something that you have to, I think this is true probably of almost all religions, that at their base, they are responding to questions that are just like the questions that are asked in, natural sciences. They want explanations of things. Now, sometimes the explanations that are asked for in religion, aren't. They want to know what's the reason for all of this. That's the kind of question that sometimes religions ask. What's the meaning? What's the significance of all of this? Not, how did this happen? What's the cause? But in religion, religious answers also are answers to the causal questions. God's supposed to be the causal account of why the universe is there. In this particular argument, there's a blending. In the cosmological argument, historically, there's been a blending of these two concerns. On the one hand, what's the cause of it all is certainly there. But you can step back from that causal question, and ask, well, just what explains it all? Not necessarily cause. What account can be given that will help me understand why the universe is there rather than not there? Even if the universe is infinite in its scope. Now, when you get, I'm getting to the answer to your question, when you get to the point where you say, it really would have, there has to be some reason there for it, and that's going to be something phenomenal. Whatever the explanation is, that's going to be something phenomenal. That's sufficient to inspire the kind of awe that people think of as religious awe. You don't have to have a physical description of God. You don't have to have, many specific characteristics that you can list. Indeed, one of the things about, it's a central theme in almost every religion there is a real sort of mystical theme. This theme, it goes like, it should be familiar to you. There's no way of describing God. God isn't something like all the other things that you're acquainted with in the world. There's no way of putting your mind around God so that you fully understand God. God is this whatever, this thing, this spiritual. You use the word being even. Almost seems like you shouldn't use any words to tie it down. It's the source of all explanation. It's the origin of all. And so if somebody gets to the point where they say, aha, well, it does require an explanation, the thing that will do that, the thing that will provide that explanation is very godlike just in that characteristic. Now, the reason I go to those lengths to sort of answer what was basically a simple question is that you shouldn't, in listening to people in these arguments for God's existence, whether you're a critic, a believer, or just sort of a non-committed neutral party, you shouldn't imagine that they're trying to say, the God that you have in your head, the one that you reject, is the one that I'm going to prove right now. That's not it. It's almost inevitably the case that the person who believes in God believes in something that's different from what you don't believe in. And so the argument that they use to justify God has to be taken on their terms. So in each of these two cases, what we came up with was in the first draft, there must have been some cause. Call it God. That's sort of a characteristic move that responds to the awesomeness of whatever it was that caused the universe. And in the case of the second draft, while there's no first cause, there's some explanation for the presence of the universe. I mean, just in thinking about what that would be, what would have brought about the existence of the universe in the way that I might stamp this circle on this page with a rubber stamp. That, in presence of the awesomeness of whatever could do something like that or could provide that account, that's enough to sort of lend the credence to the idea that the name God is deserved by that thing. Any questions about the cosmological argument before we go on to the teleological? There are two drafts of it. Should, as usual, you should try to make sure that you feel comfortable not just with the bottom line, like what they said, but why they said it, what the reasoning was that I offered for these positions. Everything clear? Principle of sufficient reason is clear. The role it plays in its general interpretation and in its causal interpretation in the two drafts of the argument. Okay. What I want to do is to talk about the teleological argument first, and then entertain questions that you may have about it, whether in the version that I outlined to you or in the version that you saw in the reading. First of all, you should get clear on this if you're not already. The teleological argument is the argument from design. So what I'm going to talk about today and present to you is an argument that really follows the lead of the argument that you read about in the William Paley handout. These aren't two different things, and I want to make sure you got them associated. You'll recognize, or you should recognize, things I say from your reading, but just in case there was any unclarity about it, I wanted to settle that. And we may have mentioned this, I can't remember exactly, we may have mentioned this word teleological as related to something earlier that we talked about when we talked about Aristotle. Did we? Does anyone remember that? Well, let me now mention to you that there's a close affinity between this argument and what Aristotle called final causes. When we explain things in the way that Aristotle referred to as a final cause style of explanation, another name for that is a teleological explanation. The word teleological comes from the Greek root telos, which means end, goal, perhaps, purpose, design. A teleological explanation explains things in terms of the end or purpose, goal or design of the thing, or function. Put that in there too. The function that a thing plays in a larger system. In other words, what role does it play? What's its point? What's it doing there? And a teleological argument is any argument that is based on some reference to an end or a purpose or a goal. So a teleological argument for God's existence is going to have something to do with some kind of end, goal, purpose, or design. Now, I mentioned before that this, along with the cosmological argument, this is an a posteriori argument. And that means what? Pardon me? First of all, it's not a proof. Exactly right. What will it make reference to? Yeah, it's going to have to make reference to some information gleaned from experience. Now, in the case of the cosmological argument, which was another a posteriori argument, in that case, the thing that it referred to that was based on experience was the claim that everything that happens for some kind of a reason, that principle of the general uniformity of nature. That was a principle that doesn't follow from pure logic. The only place you can get it is from experience. And the idea is, well, in our own individual cases, even when something seems like it's puzzling, we don't know what the explanation is. If we pursue the thing far enough, we always find out that there is some kind of explanation. That's not just our personal experience, but the experience of the entire species, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, the experience referred to is a little bit more complex. It has to do with our experience of things in the world as having a purpose, as opposed to our experience of things as being produced merely by chance. So what this proof is going to contrast, whoops, wrong way, is things produced by design or with a purpose versus things arising by chance. Okay, so the argument, the teleological argument, contrasts these two classes of things and relies upon our own experiences or our own consideration of possible experiences to determine what the difference is. I mean, how is it that we know the difference between things that are produced by chance and things that aren't? Okay? So again, this is not something that follows from pure logic or pure reason. It's an a posteriori argument. That means it's going to appeal to your own experiences. And in that light, let me ask you to consider the following potential experience. The story I'm going to tell follows some of the lines of William Paley's argument, departs from it in others to illustrate a few things that I think aren't made as clear as they might be in Paley's own version. But I'd like to consider yourself, just sort of in a situation that you may actually find attractive. One, not right now at RIT or in school or with any obligations at all in the world. I want you to consider yourself walking along all by yourself now. I mean, not in a huge class of people or in an away party from the Starship Enterprise. Instead, I want you to consider yourself all by yourself walking down some beach. Let's say in Maui. Spent a couple of weeks in Maui a few weeks ago and still thinking fondly of the place. Imagine you found a deserted beach on Maui, or even better, some really deserted island. Maui is hardly that. But imagine you're walking down this beach. It's a beautiful day. There's not much action from the ocean. It's kind of calm. You're just sort of beachcombing. You're sort of wandering along, looking at stuff. And the first thing I want you to consider is, but first of all, I want to get this off there so that you're not considering that. I want you to consider the way the sand is, let's say. I mean, it's going to be a big beach. and you've had experiences with beaches, so I think you can visualize this in your mind. It's a gentle beach. No rocks right there. There's someplace along the coasts where maybe you'll find rocky shorelines. But this is a nice, smooth beach, nice place for sunbathing. Nobody's out there, though, right now. He's walking along, and you notice that there are sort of patterns in the sand. The patterns sort of change as you get closer to the water and further away. But relatively close to the water, the sand is still more or less dry there, but relatively close to the water, you see something like, lines that are going like this, more or less following the shoreline. Let's say this is the shoreline here, and here's the waves coming in like that. But, you see some sort of just gentle ridge-like structures. As you get further back, the sand is relatively smooth, but, it's pocked. The wind there has sort of moved the sand around into somewhat gentle and less regular shapes than these ridges. But what I'd like you to consider is how these things were produced. Now, on the one hand, there's certain laws of nature, presumably, that are in effect here. But I don't think that any one of us would assume, if we were walking along that beach, that these were produced by anybody's design, or produced on purpose, or produced with any kind of goal or an end in mind. Indeed, these seem like they are really, really excellent examples of phenomena that are produced by chance. Is that okay? Because what I'm looking for right now is what I'll call a paradigm example. It's a word I want you to know. A paradigm example of things produced by chance. Will that work? First of all, what's the word paradigm mean? Good, I'm glad I wrote that down here. Does no one know?
Is it
A way of thinking? A paradigm in modern literature has come to mean a sort of a characteristic way of thinking, usually in some sort of discipline. But paradigm originally means, and even in the history of that particular usage of the word, paradigm means exceptionally good example, okay? I mean, the word example isn't exactly redundant there, but sometimes you'll hear things referred to not as paradigm examples, but as paradigm cases. That's a paradigm case of what I'm talking about. I mean, that's what that means is that's a fantastic example. That's an excellent, and that's just sort of the real, that really gets at the essence of it. A real clear-cut case. For example, if I'm talking about baldness, I mean, there are all kinds of fuzzy cases, right? Where, you're not clear whether somebody should be described as being bald or not, but there's some real good paradigm cases of baldness. Mr. T springs to mind. No, he's not, doesn't he? Does he have a mohawk? No, I'm not thinking, yeah, also, Mr. T is not a paradigm case of baldness. Who would be? Who?
George from Seinfeld.
George from Seinfeld, no.
Mr. Clean.
George from Seinfeld is not, Mr. Clean. I mean, somebody who's got no hair at all would be a paradigm case of baldness. Picard in Star Trek, maybe, yeah. But those are paradigm cases. I mean, those are exceptional cases. They're very clear cases. So what I'm looking for here is a paradigm example or a paradigm case of things produced by chance. And I've suggested, just because I want to have something later to contrast with, I want to suggest that the way that the sand is on the beach is a good paradigm case of things produced by chance. Yes? Is okay? Okay. The way the sand is not something that anybody would usually think of as something produced by design or on purpose. Now, I want, right here at the very beginning, I want to acknowledge and even insist upon the fact that this is a fallible judgment. I mean, we could be mistaken about this. It might be that someone knew that we were going to come along the beach to try and find a philosophical example. And so they completely messed, the beach before had all kinds of structure on it. And so they very carefully and very artfully arranged this beach so that it would look natural or look like it had been produced by chance, while it really hadn't. It was produced with a particular design to fool us. Now that's possible, and we have to acknowledge that. But it's not likely. The likelihood isn't there. We are not in the realm of a priori arguments where we can expect to prove anything here. And so all throughout this discussion, we're going to have to put up with the fact that we're fallible, that we can make mistakes. That's why I call this a paradigm case. It's not a perfect case, but it's about the best example I can find. And there's lots of things where there aren't any perfect cases, but they're good enough. So that's the qualification that I want to make here. I want to not only acknowledge it, but to insist upon it. It's very important that you realize that this is that we might be mistaken in thinking that this particular beach and the way the sand is on it was produced by chance. What kind of story we would have to concoct in order to see that it wasn't produced by chance, like this story about people coming along and arranging it deliberately to fool us, that will be interesting too. It will help us do what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out what is it that makes the difference between things that are produced by chance and things that are produced by design or purpose. And so, if we find out X, Y, or Z about something, if that makes us change our mind about whether it was produced by chance or not, that's going to be very interesting, because that's going to tell us some of the stuff that we need to know about what makes the difference between things that are produced by chance and things that are produced by design. So it doesn't matter much that we could be mistaken. I just want to acknowledge it. Yes, Brian?
If you're a believer in God, can't you just relate to that and just say it's an act of God? He did it.
Well, indeed you could. And we may wind up coming back round to this, since what we're embarked upon is the teleological argument for the existence of God. But if there is anything that's produced by chance, and that's the way I'm going to state this now, this sure seems like it's a paradigm case. It's the best case I'm going to find. If we find out later that God produced it for our delight and enjoyment, for example, then we will be thereby finding out that it wasn't produced by chance after all, won't we? So, but if there is anything produced by chance, this is it. Okay, let's walk a little bit further down the beach now. Okay? And we round a bend, and it's no longer the case that the beach is completely clean, pristine, uninterrupted, with just what we see is a special area over there close to the water, far away at first. We walk up to it, and what we realize is that somebody's been here making sand castles and sand designs. Now, you need to visualize this yourself. I hope in telling the story that you kind of automatically do that. Everybody's going to have a different picture in mind of what's down there, but that's okay. Each person take your own picture. As a matter of fact, the greater diversity of pictures of what we encounter, the more information we'll have about what it takes to distinguish things that are produced by chance from things that are produced by design. But one part of seeing that sandcastles had been built there, that somebody's been here producing sandcastles, is distinguishing this area from the rest of the beach and noticing that this sure looks like some of this stuff's been done on purpose. Okay? Now, the castles could be very elaborate and artistic, or they could just be, some sand heaped up over here to make a wall and a channel. I mean, those are the kinds of sand castles I make. Just throw a bunch of sand over here. So there's a wall, and then pile some up as high as I can with a pail, and there's a turret, and then I put a little dot, and there's a guy. I don't know. I'm not very imaginative when it comes to doing that sort of stuff. But it could be anything you like, and it could be in a variety of shapes, states of disrepair. I mean, you can still recognize a sandcastle sometimes after it's really very much eroded. So there's all these different sort of situations that you might want to envision. My question for you, what's the difference? How do we know that this thing, because we do it. We recognize things. And again, we're fallible here too. Some of the things that we might think are the products of design might not be, after all. This happens a lot with rock formations that look like they're sculptures, but in fact they've been produced by the wind. I mean, some such things are very surprising indeed. Some rocks have been weathered by water in such a way that they really look like they've been polished by some practitioner. I mean, they're so symmetrical sometimes, but in fact it was just the random operation of waves and sand in polishing the stone. So we can be mistaken there too. It's fallible, but that's why I want to use the example of sandcastles. We could be mistaken there, but some sandcastles, it's just really very, very unlikely that we're mistaken given some normal experiences that we have. What's the difference? How do we know these things? What is it in the scene? I mean, because there must be information there that we're somehow assimilating that tells us that these particular things that we're experiencing were produced by were produced by design, whereas the rest of the beach is not. What is it? And you'll need to reflect on this. What's the indication? Yeah. Look.
It depends. If you're trying to make something by design, but you make a mistake, does that make a chance?
Now you're perhaps reflecting on some of the things that Aristotle said about chance earlier on in the quarter. Chance can enter in, and probably does inevitably enter into any creation. But we're making a global judgment here. As much as some mistakes must have been made, as much as like somebody was, when you're trying to do something, the wind comes up and blows the sand down in a way that you hadn't envisioned. There's always chance elements in the making of anything. The water comes up and does something that you didn't expect. There's always chance elements in any construction of sandcastles, but any construction of anything for that matter. So chance will enter in. But the global judgment, when we're walking along the beach here, there's something that was produced by design. No matter how much chance may have entered in the process of construction, am I wrong in thinking that you would make that judgment too? That here's something that was done, somebody did this on purpose. This was done deliberately. So what tells us? That's the question. I'm not asking any other question except that. What's the information? What's the diff? In the back.
Our experiences.
Okay, our experiences. But Joe, that doesn't tell me very much. I want something more specific. What is it in these particular examples
Have you seen it before?
that we've seen? Well, we've seen sand before. We've seen both before. We're going to have to find something that we can say about the one that we can't say about the other.
You've seen these particular shapes?
Well, now, let's see. Is it that, have we not seen the particular shapes in the sand? Is that what you're saying?
No, the sandcastle shape.
I know, but I'm looking for the contrast. Are you suggesting that we have seen the particular shapes of the sandcastle, but we haven't seen the particular shapes of the sand on the beach before?
No, we've seen both, and we know the difference.
Yeah, I know, but I want to know what tells us is the difference. Let me go here.
We've seen people commonly build sandcastles,
Okay, we've seen the building process. We've witnessed it.
but
We've done it ourselves. But we've never seen anybody mold a beach. Interesting. How am I going to put that down briefly as a first possibility? We know, we understand the construction process. How's that? But maybe we have to say a little more, and it involves people, right? So it's a familiar object. It's a familiar object. So it involves, this suggestion involves familiarity. With the object. And construction process. Brian, were you going to suggest something different?
It was right, same.
Basically that. All right, let's hold with that. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, that would distinguish, see what I'm saying? I think that would distinguish, at least especially as the "and it involves people" clause, that does make a distinction between our past experience of sandcastles and our past experience of beaches. The main focus of experience has to be on this present experience as we look at these different things on the beach. That's experience too. The word experience doesn't just refer to the past. It also refers to all the stuff that's going on right now. You are right now experiencing the boring sound of my voice. Okay? So you're right now experiencing, so experience doesn't specifically refer to the past. Okay, let's walk a little bit further out of the beach, see if we can sustain this particular one, and use an example that will be familiar from Paley's article. Let's say we walk a little bit further on and we find a watch. Now the watch I think Paley may have had in mind wasn't a wristwatch, it probably was a pocket watch. It certainly wasn't digitized, it was digital. It'll be, you know, a watch with a movement and gears and springs and stuff inside. But we don't know that when we first see the watch. Let's say we see an intact watch. Now, let's allow this one, the intact watch, to be a paradigm case of something that plainly was designed. Now, while it's possible that molecules and atoms would come together in a certain way to form a perfect watch, or not a perfect watch, but a watch, that's so unlikely as to make it pretty outrageous. It's probably even more unlikely that that could happen, that a watch could come to be by chance, than that beach could come to be by design. So this is probably a slightly better paradigm of something that's the product of design. But, you know, imagine your favorite watch, pick it up, and ask yourself, does this characteristic distinguish between the paradigm, this case of something that we see it? I mean, the first thing not the first thing, but part of our seeing it as a watch is seeing that it's designed, it has a function. We understand what its function is, we know what it's for. And for it to be for something, it must have been the product of someone's intention. Yeah?
I think these two examples are switching or contrasting themselves, because at first we're looking at water, its weight and things in the sand, and we're looking at why they're there, why the sand comes through. I'm looking at this watch, why it's there, someone not the cause of its existence. The cause of its existence, or the reason for it, has nothing to do with the beach.
Okay, so all right, you're not wondering how this watch came into existence. You're wondering, how did it get here on the scene? Well, then the story isn't playing isn't playing for you the role that I want it to. Like, I'd like us to be able to walk through countless other scenes, like watch factories, for example, and still we would be able to distinguish which things were the products of design. Like the watch. See, the watch we find on the beach, there's a lot of questions we can ask about it. One is, how did it come into existence? The other is, how in the hell did it get here? But if we were walking through a watch factory, we'd still recognize, you know, the watches that we see as being products of design without having much reason to worry about how it got there. I mean, it wouldn't be out of place or anything like that. So I want us to focus on that one question, how the thing came into existence. Which things are products of chance and which things are products of design. But we would recognize, I think, or maybe you're saying that we wouldn't, but I mean, I think that one of the things that would be plain about this watch is that it wasn't produced by chance. No one would think that it was produced by chance. How about, does this criterion tell us what it is that we see? I mean, do we understand the construction process and that it involves people? You say yes. Joe says no. Somebody else. Adjudicate. Yes or no? Well, that's because you're just sitting with him. That's why. Here's but no. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Do we understand the construction process? I mean, that we do know about it, right? We know. I mean, there's different senses of understanding here. Like in the case of sandcastles, I built them myself. In the case of watches, I never did that. But I know enough about it. They're made in factories usually. I suppose they could be made by handmade by somebody at a workbench. But I have an idea about what kind of materials would be involved. I know it would require tools, and it certainly is my experience that it's made by people. So this is maybe some modification of this, especially where it comes to understanding the construction process, would allow it to go through. So maybe that's it. Let's walk a little bit further along the beach, okay? We may come back to the watch and the sand castles and all that stuff later, but I want to make our way down this beach. We got time. We can only loaf here on this beach for another 20 minutes or so. Let's say we come across something that's washed up on the shore. Now I'm going to step out of character and tell you what this thing is. As it happens, there's been a shipwreck out to sea some time ago, and the whole ship broke up. Okay, and so what you got here is a piece of machinery off of some part of this ship. It's just a piece of machinery. It's just a chunk. It's not like a whole machine. It's not like an intact watch. But it's washed up here on the shore. My claim is, first, that not only I won't know, first of all, I'm not going to know what this thing is. Now I'm back in the story. I'm walking off the beach. I pick it up, I look at it, I look all around. My first question is, what the hell is this for? But, plainly I see that it's the product of design. It's a hunk of a machine. But I don't know what it's for. I don't know, perhaps, how it was constructed. Okay? I'm not nearly as familiar with, I'm certainly not familiar with it in the way that I'm familiar with watches. How do you feel about number one now? We understand construction process and that it involves people. I see this thing. The involvement of people might just be another way of saying I can see it was designed, right? This might not be providing me with any more information. As a matter of fact, before we consider this, let's walk a little bit further down the beach. And I can encounter another thing, just to avoid certain problems. And let me tell you the story about this. An alien spacecraft has crashed in the sea. Now, the aliens in this spacecraft are nothing like human beings. They don't sit. They don't have arms and legs exactly. They certainly don't have two of them. They certainly don't have hands like ours. They have something, presumably, to manipulate with, or they wouldn't be able to be a spacefaring species. Completely different species. That means, anything that, that supports their weight won't look like a chair. Anything they're supposed to grab won't look like a handle. And that's the reason for postulating that they're really weird creatures. So they're going to be totally alien in physical form. This ship crashed, completely broke up, and there's a part of it here. Now, the things that the machine does, that this part came from, are beyond my comprehension. This is a star-faring spacecraft. I have no clue about anything about it. The materials are materials I've never seen before. They don't completely dissolve in water, obviously, because they've washed up here on the beach, and they don't wither away in our atmosphere, because they've washed up here on the beach. But here is a piece of a machine. Now, back in the story, this is a little harder to have an intuition about. But because I think any machine at all that's built by anybody, any species in the world, is going to finally have to obey physical laws if it's to work, I think I'll recognize this as a part of a machine. I'll see, in particular, this is designed to do something. What? I don't know. I mean, I've got no experience with the construction method. It doesn't involve people as such, but it will look to me like it involves some kind of designer. I mean, I'll see that. Now, that's my intuition about this, that even with such an alien thing, I'd be able, although of course I might be wrong about this, but I'd be able to see pretty clearly this is the product of design. I think we have to dig a little bit deeper than this. I'm not familiar with the construction process. I have no clue what this thing's supposed to do. I can see that somebody designed it, but I still don't know yet what it is about these things that tells me that. What is it about? Maybe there's different things in each case. That's something we have to be alert to. Paley argues, and I'm going to try and make that argument as plausible as I can here, that there's a commonality throughout these things that we experience as being designed. There's a common feature that just is the sign of something's being designed. Back there.
Don't you, I mean, wouldn't you automatically know it's got to be by design if you put two machines in one room for however long, they're not going to reproduce, so something must have made them at some point. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but our paradigm case is something produced by chance won't reproduce either. That was sand on the beach, right?
That's a natural act. It's not like you sat there and went, okay, water, you go this way and do this and do that. I mean, it's not.
Right, but I want to, but what we're distinguishing, I mean, what we see in all of these different examples of artifacts, what we see is that they are the product of design. That they are not just the products of what you just now called as natural forces. That somebody had to intervene, somebody intervened and made them the way they are. I mean, I'm not saying anything different. I want to know, how do you know that? I mean, you're telling me that here's the difference. These things are designed and these things aren't. These things are the products of natural processes and these things aren't. Exactly right. How do we know that? How do I know that? Now, not how am I absolutely sure about that. If you want me to be cautious here, because again, we could be mistaken. What tells us that? What is it that yells at us in this watch, or in the sandcastles, or in the pieces of machinery, whether they're from boats or spaceships? What is it that's yelling at us that says, designed, 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 not just the product of natural processes? What is it that tells us that?
I think that this still works because you may not know the construction of it, but someone else might.
But I'm the one that's making the judgment. I mean, I see that there is a construction process that someone else surely understands. How do I see that? You're exactly right about what I see. I want to know, how do I see that? What's telling me in there? Moise.
Because of, well, just looking through the definition you gave us at Tellus, there's like a unstated understanding that these objects you're finding have an end, a goal, a purpose.
Yep.
A design, a function.
Yep. There's the unstated one. I'm trying to get you guys to state it. What is it? We see it. See, this is something we do, right? We can do it. We do it quick without thinking about it. I'm asking you to reflect on what it must be that's telling us this. Is seeing that something designed, I mean, is it so, are you trying to tell me there's no reason for it? We just see that it's designed. I mean, is it like just saying, there's no, I mean, because this would be true, there's no reason for my seeing that that's red, it's just red. Seeing that something's designed is a lot more complicated than that. Isn't that a judgment? That must be based on something more basic? I mean, there must be something about these experiences, these visual experiences, and they're going to be tactual experiences. We can feel the things sometimes, but there's something about these experiences that gives us some kind of clue. They say, this one's designed, this one isn't. Sometimes we can do it at a glance, right? Other times we have to inspect it. Sometimes we might have to take something apart. Ah, yeah, I can see now. This isn't just a rock. This is a piece of jewelry.
Can't we understand everything that's put together that's natural, right?
So can we say that what we don't recognize as being natural is done by design? Like we see the sand as being natural, we see rocks as being natural.
Okay, what was the part about being put together?
Well, if we see something that we don't recognize as occurring naturally, we can put them together.
So the default is design.
Yeah, if we don't.
So everything's
recognize
designed that we don't see as,
naturally occurring. Like if we see this piece of the alien ship and we don't recognize it as being naturally occurring.
So non-recognition says, see, this is very interesting. More often than not, I mean, as a matter of fact, I think we just did it here a while ago. People will say, the thing that tells us that something's designed is that we recognize it as familiar. And what you're saying is the opposite. The thing that tells us that something's designed is that we don't recognize it. It's not familiar.
Yeah, well, we don't recognize it as being natural.
As being. Oh, all right. Maybe that sounded good for a second, but now it's sounding less good to me. I'll tell you why. Maybe it's just by definition, right? If we don't see that it's natural, there's only one other option, right?
Basically.
If we can't figure out which natural processes would have put it together, that's an interesting one. I don't know how far we could go with that. If we can't figure out, if we're not familiar with natural processes, natural ones that would have produced this thing, then we sort of default to the other option that's design. Must be design. Very interesting possibility. All right, the problem for Paley is that he thinks that there definitely is something that we're seeing. I mean, there's a positive thing. It's not just a default, a negative thing. That's a very interesting possibility. I think you should hang on to that as a real-life possibility. But in presenting the teleological argument for God's existence, I'm going to follow Paley's line. He says it's not just a negative thing like that. There's a positive feature that designed things all have in common. And it's kind of it comes down to this. It has to do with the way the parts relate to one another. The parts of the thing. And now we've had several examples of things, and they have different kinds of parts. I mean, the parts of the watch are different from what the parts of the sandcastle would be. And but the parts of the thing are related to one another in clearly, I'll call them right now, functional relationships, but we'll have to flesh that out. Whereas the parts of things produced by chance aren't. Let's first of all look at the parts of things produced by chance, like that. Going back to our original example of the sand on the beach. What are the parts? Well, it's basically the grains of sand, I suppose, and they're just heaped on one another. There's no particularly interesting relationships among the parts. One is on top of the other. You could indiscriminately replace this sand with that sand, and it wouldn't make any difference to the beach, right? It would still be the beach. And so there's no particular arrangement of the parts vis-a-vis one another or vis-a-vis any larger whole that they make up. There's nothing that could be described as a pattern or anything like that. Whereas the claim is, in everything that we recognize as design, we see relationships, special relationships between the parts. Like, this looks like it's designed to shunt a liquid in the case of these machine parts that we run. Let's say it's a pipe that we pick up. This looks like this slope here leads into that slope there. And this slope, these slopes are too carefully integrated with one another to have been the product of chance. It's the integration of parts into larger wholes. It's in the watch. You open up the watch, let's say. This little wheel, you turn this wheel, it catches onto this other little wheel, that tightens this spring up here. that does this, that, the other thing. I mean, even if you don't know what the total upshot's supposed to be, you can see that there's a relationship between the parts, an integration of them, not just a heap. I guess the easiest way to see this is by contrast with the sand on the beach, the paradigm case of things produced by chance. That's just a heap. It's this functional relationship of parts to one another, says Paley, and to the whole that they are parts of, their integration into a kind of a wholeness. That's what is the sign of something produced by design. Okay, so I'll say an integrity, how's that? Of parts vis-a-vis okay, things produced by design reveal an integrity of parts vis-a-vis one another. Vis-a-vis means as related to, and to the whole that they are parts of. Okay, I've got room for clarification question rather than a comment right now, because I need to walk a little bit further down the beach. Okay? That's what Paley claims, and I think all the alternatives that some of you have been thinking about, each and every one of them might be fleshed out so that they would be good rivals of this one. But just because we're pursuing Paley's argument, or something like Paley's argument, this is the kind of thing I think he has in mind as the criterion or the characteristic that we see in things, that we can experience in things that tells us that they are the products of design rather than of chance. So armed with this one now, Paley's suggestion, which is our suggestion number 2. Last one was that we understand the construction process and it involves people, basically a familiarity criterion. There could be many others. Let's walk a little bit further down the beach. This time we round a bend and there's a sunbather or a plant or any other organism. Aha, says Paley. What do we know? You shouldn't take them apart. That's not good, especially, the higher organisms. But what do we know about the parts of such things? Well, what we know is, Paley reminds us, what we know is that in such organisms, the watch actually pales by comparison. The way that the parts of a watch are functionally related to one another is nothing compared to the way that the parts of a biological organism are related to one another. The efficiency of biological organisms in producing an end result, namely continuation of life, is absolutely phenomenal. So, in short, if we think the watch, by virtue of the integrity of its parts, is a clear case of something that's been designed, well, then we're bound to admit that the organism, the human being especially, must be also the product of design because it has that quality, that feature, even more than the watch does. And then to back off even to a larger scale, if you think about the whole world, including that beach and including the sand and including the waters and the winds, they all are part of a big, huge ecology, not just a planetary ecology, but a galactic and even a universal ecology. Everything obeys the laws of nature. Everything is, in the end, the product of principles of laws. Now, why should there be laws and principles in a world that's produced by chance? That seems to be saying two opposite things, Paley might argue. Now, the argument, and that's the end of the argument, except for the last step, which says it would appear that at least the organisms on the planet, creatures like ourselves, and when you step back a bit, it would seem that the whole universe is kind of like a big clockwork. It's kind of like a big, huge whole whose parts interact in this very intimate way. It all looks like it's something that's the product of design, especially to somebody like Paley, who grew up in the Newtonian era when the physical world really did look like it behaved as a clockwork. We back up and look at the whole universe as if it were a clock. It looks like it's designed. And where you have the product of design, there must be a designer. There must be someone who intended, some being that intended this, that produced it, that created it as a product of design now. And that sure does sound like God. Now, I only want to summarize right now the two arguments, the cosmological and the teleological, in very brief terms. I don't want to repeat them. The cosmological argument, on the one hand, picks up the relatively common intuition among people who believe in God that the very existence of the earth, because everything has to have a cause and everything has to have an explanation, almost requires that there be a God. It just doesn't make sense to think of the earth as just sort of, or not just the earth, but the world and the universe as just sort of being there with no explanation whatsoever. It doesn't make sense to think of the Big Bang. I mean, you can believe in Big Bang theory, you can believe in all state-of-the-art physics, but it just doesn't make sense that the whole thing wouldn't have any explanation. Why should it be there? That's kind of the upshot of the cosmological argument. And this teleological argument is also very familiar. The world is too complex, especially when you look at life, and especially when you look at the human mind and brain, and the fact that people aren't just machines, it seems. They have feelings and souls. It's just impossible to imagine that this is the product of chance. And that's what the teleological argument exploits. Both of them are a posteriori arguments. That means that they are not proofs, but because they exploit our own experience of things and appeal to our own experiences of things, they have a wider range of application, and therefore perhaps a bit more plausibility. And I think that's why where people have reasons for believing in God, where people express their reasons for believing in God, these reasons are often up there among them.